Welcome to the Caretakers, a show where we'll talk about what it means to be a caretaker on Earth. Whether we're intentional about it or not, we're all caretakers. We've been entrusted to take care of our family, our friends, our environment, and ourselves. We'll talk about strategies for taking care of yourself, mentally, physically, and spiritually. We'll talk about what it means to take care of others, from your neighbor across the street to the neighbor across the globe. This is going to be a journey of self-discovery and reflection, and we hope you join us as we strive to be the best caretakers we can be. Well, welcome to the Caretakers podcast.
Thank you very much, Basil, for having me.
It's a pleasure to introduce our guest. Michael Lynk is well known, I would say, locally and even globally. He is a professor emeritus at Western University. He's very well known in the legal community for his work on labor and human rights law. And in March 2016, the UN Human Rights Council appointed Professor Lynk as the 7th Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in the Palestinian Territories occupied since 1967. During his 6 years as Special Rapporteur, he regularly addressed the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva and the Third Committee of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. His UN reports have been widely cited. He has frequently spoken to UN academic and institutional conferences in North America, Europe, and the Middle East, and has regularly published opinion pieces on the role of international law respecting the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. So thank you very much for being here. It's an honor and a privilege.
And I'm glad to be here as well. Thank you for thinking of me.
So I want to start with your role as the UN Special Rapporteur. So what was your mandate when you were in that role?
Sure. Let me give you a bit of background. The United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the leading human rights body within the United Nations, has created what is called UN Special Procedures. And that is the body with about 60 UN Special Rapporteurs and independent human rights experts who have a variety of mandates to look at issues either globally or centered in one particular area. So of the 60, about 45 of them are UN Special Rapporteurs with a global mandate. The UN Special Rapporteur on food security, the UN Special Rapporteur on water, the UN Special Rapporteur on housing, and so on. And about 14 or 15 of them would have a specific country or area mandate. The UN Special Rapporteur for human rights in North Korea, Cambodia, Myanmar, Sudan, and in my case, the occupied Palestinian Territories. So my duty during the 6 years of the mandate that I was serving was to write reports to the UN, to bring attention through press releases, through interviews, through panels, and a variety of other means to the world of what are the human rights trends in the occupied Palestinian territory. We are not paid. We're not UN staff, special rapporteurs. So I kept my day job as a full-time law professor here at Western University. But I would have to try to find an extra 3 months a year to do the work that was required as a UN Special Rapporteur. And this, I suppose, not being paid and not being part of UN staff, that gave me and gave the other UN Special Rapporteurs the autonomy and the freedom to be able to say what we thought was important with respect to this. So while my reports would occasionally get criticism, mostly from those who would be in support of Israel and its occupation, I think they were well read, not only within the UN, but also within diplomatic and political and civil society circles as well. So that was probably one of the most gratifying aspects of knowing the impact that they wound up having.
Right. And just to make it clear for people who are listening, you and I are familiar with the term occupied Palestinian territories, but in the colloquial terms that we're using now, what areas does that actually make up?
Very good point. It means East Jerusalem,
okay,
with the West Bank and Gaza. It includes all the areas that Israel would have captured in June 1967 of the remaining part of the old Mandate Palestine borders.
Got it. Okay. And when you were doing this work, where were you situated?
Here in London.
Here in London.
As I said, I kept my full-time job as a law professor. I would travel regularly. But the advent, obviously, of being able to communicate to the world virtually meant that I would have done more and more of my interviews, more and more of my conference appearances, more and more of my delivery of reports virtually particularly during the pandemic.
Right. And when you were collecting information, how did you go about doing that?
I wasn't allowed to go into Israel or the occupied Palestinian territory.
Okay.
Israel, um, I suppose, didn't technically forbid me, but I have to seek an invitation from them. I would write them every time I was planning to go. They would never reply. All I received back was silence.
Mm.
So I never went. I would go to Amman instead each year. And there would be UN officials and civil society organizations from Israel and from Palestine would come across the Jordan River and meet me in Amman. Um, the advantage I had though was that there were. This is probably the most uh, documented conflict, human rights conflict in the modern world. So there are a number of really top drawer Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations that do regular, in depth, high quality reporting. So I relied a lot on that. I relied upon the fact there is still some democratic space within Israel and within Palestine to allow this kind of journalistic reporting as well. So that was where I would have found my sources to be able to write my reports.
Right. And when you wrote those reports, where were they? I mean, you mentioned that they were published obviously through the UN, and I've seen that through that. But where else could somebody read these reports if they wanted to find them?
Well, they're not easy to find. I mean, it's a
Mhm.
bit of a trail to try to find them on the UN website, but that's where they would be posted. But they were relatively widely reported by civil society organizations that would either post them in toto, or they would quote extensively from them. So eventually, I think if you were looking for my reports or looking for what they said, you just have to Google my name or Michael Lynk Special Rapporteur, and that would lead to the reports. It would lead to the reporting on the reports, and it would lead to how uh, journalist outlets and civil society would wind up using them.
Right. And while you were in your role as a special rapporteur, two large human rights organizations, both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, issued their own reports where they provided evidence of the crimes of apartheid and persecution against Israeli officials. Were you at all surprised by those reports when they came out?
This is an interesting question.
Yeah.
When I became special rapporteur in 2016, there was a small group, Palestinian civil society organizations, who were regularly using the term apartheid and had anchored it in international law. But outside of that there wasn't a large number of organizations that were talking about it. And I said to myself um, at the very beginning, I'm not going to use the word apartheid because it's only going to be divisive. It's going to make it harder for me to open doors to speak to diplomats or political decision makers, and it's not yet widely accepted. 6 years later, coming and when I was preparing my final report in March 2022, my mind had completely changed. First of all, um, and credit to the human rights movement, the term apartheid had now gained a huge amount of traction because of the facts on the ground. And you're right, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Bet Salem, Yashdin among Israeli human rights organizations, Al Haq, the Palestine Human Rights Center, Al Mizan among Palestinian human rights organizations. All of them had done an analysis of apartheid, anchored it in international law, and there was an open invitation for me to be able to do that. And so I devoted my 12th and final report 2 years ago to looking at the question of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory. And I came to the conclusion that is apartheid. Um, you know, Albert Camus once said something to the effect of uh, mislabeling what is happening in front of you um, winds up giving a false impression to the world. You have to try to answer honestly when facts make change your mind with respect to this. So when I looked at what was going on in the occupied Palestinian territory, the facts were overwhelming that this was apartheid. Why? There are many reasons, but probably the single clearest reason is that in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, there were very clearly two different political and legal systems based solely on one's ethnicity um, and nationality. If you were Palestinian in East Jerusalem, you lived under a whole series of restrictive Israeli laws. No right to be able to vote for the government that rules over you. Same thing is true in the West Bank, even more so in the sense of the ability to be able to confiscate Palestinian land, the ability to be able to put more and more security barriers and put a large population into a small confined area of land, surrounded by checkpoints, walls, Israeli settler-only roads, dead-end streets, and so on, was hurting a population in order to be able to better control them. And on the other side of the coin were the 700,000 plus Israeli settlers
Right.
who enjoy full Israeli citizenship, the ability to be able to vote, to participate politically in Israel, to be able to take advantage of an economy with a European style economic standard of living theirs. And that's all within the same geographic and political space. So what is that but apartheid? If there's a better word in the English language, show it to me and I'd be happy to use it. But for now, apartheid is exactly what this process is. Violation of the 1973 Convention Against Apartheid, a violation of the 1998 Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, one of the most, I suppose, heinous of human rights crimes in the modern world.
Right. And if anyone's interested in looking at these reports, I mean, Human Rights Watch in particular, I thought did a really good job of putting simple graphics in the report and summarizing it in these videos that you can watch.
Yeah.
And so the report is something like 80 pages or something like that. And so it's a read. I've done it, and I've done it to prepare for presentations and stuff. But if you're just looking for the summary of the report, I think Human Rights Watch has maybe an 8-minute video, and Amnesty International has something like a 14-minute video with graphics, and you can see that difference that you're talking about, that side by side of what are the rights that an Israeli settler enjoys versus a Palestinian who's born in the occupied territories.
So we now have a situation where the entire blue chip international and regional human rights organizations all accept and promote the idea that what Israel is practicing is apartheid. And this is slowly beginning to creep into mainstream conversation. You won't find newspapers yet in the mainstream that will say this is apartheid, but they will acknowledge that these reputable human rights organizations are saying that it's apartheid. And I think when you go to a younger generation that's used to access to social media, you're exactly right. They'll watch the videos from Amnesty International. They'll watch the videos from Human Rights Watch. They'll watch the statements coming out from human rights organizations in Palestine and in Israel. And that will be one of their prime sources of information for this. And as you said, we have these very thick reports, 150 pages, 200 pages from Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch, and from these other Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations that lay it out, I think, in clear prose, but well anchored and well defended by current international law.
Absolutely. And so international law is something that we hear about all the time, and then there's mechanisms to I guess deal with differences in opinion on international law. And one of those mechanisms is the International Court of Justice. I'd like to hear what your explanation of the ICJ is.
Sure. Let's talk about what the ICJ is. The International Court of Justice has been around in its current form since 1945, right at the birth of the modern United Nations. It is a court. It's the highest court in the UN system. It's based in The Hague in Netherlands. It has 15 judges who are elected for 9-year terms by the UN General Assembly, and they represent different regions in the world. As we know from all the publicity that occurred in January, at the very end of December 2023, South Africa brought an application to the International Court of Justice as a signatory of the 1948 Genocide Convention, claiming that Israel was either committing genocide or was on the path to committing genocide through its war on Gaza. That was heard 2 weeks later by the court on the 10th and 11th, or 11th and 12th of January. And then 2 weeks after that, on the 26th of January, the 15 judges, 15 judges, plus they had two temporary judges, one from South Africa, one from Israel, also in the court. So the 17 judges issued their decision, and generally by a vote of 15-2, they said that South Africa has made out a plausible case of genocide, which was all that South Africa had to make out in order to be able to get these provisional measures, which are like injunctions in our legal system.
Right.
And the provisional measures ordered by the court against Israel said Israel had to comply with the Genocide Convention and its conduct of the war. And it also said that it had to be able to enable adequate humanitarian aid to be able to enter Gaza, to be able to have access to the millions who are starving and in extreme deprivation in Gaza. It did not order a ceasefire, and that's probably the hole in the heart of the ruling.
Right.
I like to call the judgment a glass 3/4 full, because it by and large proved South Africa's case that we're witnessing the plausibility of an actual genocide. We, and South Africa was saying, we as South Africa, as signatory to the Genocide Convention, we had an obligation to bring this to the court, to do everything we can to try to bring this this unfolding atrocity to an end.
Right. And what were some of the things that South Africa brought forth as evidence of
hmm
a plausible case of genocide?
I read probably 3 times the 84-page application brought by South Africa. It is very readable, accessible to people who are not lawyers. Up until that point, it was the best single reference to what's been going on in Gaza at that point, the 2 months into the war. Now we're into 5 months with respect to this war. But so what South Africa had to prove in order to be able to say there was a plausible case of genocide was, number one, there were acts that would amount to genocide according to the 48 Genocide Convention, and number two, that Israel was acting with genocidal intent.
Mhm.
So it had to be able to establish a plausible case for both of those. And the court was persuaded by its arguments in terms of the acts, in terms of not simply the extraordinary death toll. At that point in time, the death toll was around 18,000 Palestinian dead by the end of the December, beginning of January, but also for the means by which the war had been conducted, the cutting off of water, cutting off of food, the lack of shelter, the utter destruction of virtually every building in north and central Gaza, and obviously creeping south into the southern part of Gaza as well.
Right.
And with respect to intent, what South Africa provided was approximately 35 quotes made in October, November, December by Israeli officials, which indicated I guess, their intent to want to either expel the population or to wipe out the population or large parts of it. The court in turn quoted 3 of those citations. They quoted the Minister of Defense of Israel saying a couple days after October 7th that we are going to cut off all food, all water, everything. These are animals that are in there. And they also quoted the President of Israel, who said something to the effect of, there are no innocents there, none.
Right.
Everybody in Gaza is guilty of what happened on October 7th. So those were 2 of the sharpest citations of intent that the court relied upon. Now keep this in mind. These were provisional measures that were ordered by the court.
Okay.
The court hasn't established genocide is actually taking place. That will only occur when the court convenes in a couple of years' time to have a full hearing with respect to whether or not genocide is occurring. And going by other parallel cases, such as going on in Myanmar, I would not expect this to occur for another 3 years or 4 years at the earliest. Unfortunately, the court moves very quickly on a provisional measure.
Right.
It moves very slowly with respect to the actual full trial and full hearing on whether genocide has been committed or not.
Right. And so in my mind, when I watched the hearings, and I did watch the hearings, I think on the 11th and 12th, like you said, I was expecting that Israel would have to come back after a month and make a similar type of presentation to say these are the things that we've done to prevent this, plausible case of genocide. I didn't see that, and so can you explain what happened there?
Sure. One of the orders made by the court on the 26th of January was that Israel had to come back within a month by the 26th of February and give a report as to what it was doing to comply with the orders. And apparently it did submit a report by the 26th of February. That report is confidential. It has been shared, to the best of my understanding, with South Africa. And what South Africa is doing now is writing its own report to counter or to answer what Israel has said. Keep in mind this. I mean, one of the key provisional measures ordered at the end of January was, as I said, for Israel to ensure that sufficient humanitarian aid was entering Gaza in order to be able to prevent starvation and widespread famine. In January, when that order was made, there were approximately 150 trucks of humanitarian aid entering into Gaza every day.
Right.
That's way down from what was going on before the 7th of October, when there were approximately 500 trucks a day going into Gaza. But 150 trucks a day in January. By the end of February, that had declined to somewhere between 90 and 100 trucks a day. So I'm very interested in wanting to see how Israel says that it's complying with the provisional measures orders, particularly when it comes to the provision of humanitarian aid, when the amount of aid actually decreased substantially during
Right.
February. And we now have all of these reports, all of these warnings coming from UN officials talking about starvation and famine in various parts of Gaza, including particularly in the north, where Israel does have full military control.
Right. So the ICJ hearing that we're referring to is not the only ICJ hearing that's taking place. So back in December 2022, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution asking for an advisory opinion on whether the occupation of the Palestinian territories remains lawful. And you were there for some of that proceedings. So what can you tell us about that?
Sure. As you said, the General Assembly passed this resolution overwhelmingly back in December 2022, asking the same court, the ICJ, for an advisory opinion, as to whether or not Israel's occupation is still lawful. And what the court heard in mid-February was 6 days of arguments led by Palestine, and then there were 50 other countries, as well as 3 international organizations: the League of Arab States, the Council of Islamic Cooperation, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the African Union, all made presentations to the court. And this is the largest number of states ever to intervene to give arguments in front of the court on an advisory opinion request coming from a competent UN body. So Palestine, on the first day, the 19th of February, argued that they made 3 basic arguments as to say why the occupation is now illegal. One, they said that Israel is practicing apartheid, which is a serious crime under international law, as we've discussed, and that in itself would void Israel's ongoing occupation. 2, they pointed out that Israel has been denying Palestinian self-determination, and they pointed to the many, many resolutions adopted particularly by the General Assembly and by the Human Rights Council, which said that the Palestinians have the right to self-determination. And 3, Israel has been practicing annexation.
Right.
And under the laws of modern occupation, an occupying power can only occupy the territory temporarily, and perhaps the rule of thumb there is no more than, say, 10 years at the very most. And an occupying power does not have the right to annex even a square centimeter of land. And Israel has, in 1967, annexed East Jerusalem, and large parts of the West Bank, and is in the process of de facto annexing most of the rest of the West Bank through its 300 settlements and its 500,000 settlers in the West Bank. So all of those were pointed out by Palestine. And then in the days that followed, we had arguments made, compelling arguments made by South Africa, Namibia, um, Bangladesh, Pakistan, even small countries like the Gambia or Guyana made very compelling arguments in support of the argument that the occupation has become illegal. And they focused on either the issue of apartheid or the issue of annexation or the issue of the denial of Palestinian self-determination to be able to establish their point. There only were a handful of countries that appeared which argued against trying to persuade the court not to come to a finding that the occupation is illegal. The United States, its primary argument, as the primary argument made by the United Kingdom, was that if you give an answer to this, you're only going to mess up the peace process. You're going to make it more difficult. You're going to drive the parties further apart. I don't know how much further apart they could ever be, given the permanence of at least the intent of permanence of the Israeli occupation. And then a handful of other countries such as Hungary, Fiji, Zambia also made similar arguments as well to the court. But as I said, the overwhelming number of countries that made presentations and arguments, primarily coming from the global south, were the ones who said this occupation is illegal, and there are very solid grounds within human rights law to be able to come to that conclusion.
Right. And so, about the peace process, it reminds me of Canada's reaction to a lot of these ICJ rulings. And anytime there's something that comes up about this issue, we continuously hear about the peace process. We hear about a two-state solution, a just and lasting peace in the Middle East is a phrase that's often used. And then you see the reaction of Canadian officials to the ICJ decision, for example, the provisional measures back in January. And their reaction or lack thereof of a reaction isn't surprising, but it is disappointing, as it usually is. It seems like things are still business as usual from a Canadian perspective. Did you expect that, or do you think that's even true?
Well, expect that at one level, yes. I'm familiar with Canada's recent policy and lack of action, and certainly its voting record at the General Assembly, strongly against the basket of Palestinian resolutions that come 4 votes every December at the General Assembly. But at another level, I'm always surprised because Canada says that it backs the UN system. It says that it's a strong supporter of international law. It says that it's a fervent supporter of the International Court of Justice. So when the decision on the provisional measures with respect to the Genocide Convention were issued by the International Court of Justice on the 26th of January, Canada immediately said, we're a strong supporter of the ICJ, but we do not accept the premise of the South African case. Now, show me why is there so much daylight between Canada's reaction with respect to 3 other recent rulings coming from the ICJ with respect to provisional measures? One having to do with Myanmar, one having to do with torture in Syria, and one having to do with Russian invasion of Ukraine. On each of those 3 occasions over the last 2 years, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures, strong provisional measures that were legally binding against Russia, against Myanmar, and with respect to Syria. And on each of those occasions, Canada joined other countries in the global north to say, we strongly endorse the findings of the International Court of Justice. We support the orders of provisional measures, and we want to see these countries follow through on this. But in this case, there is all kinds of daylight between that previous stance, and it's now saying, well, no, we're not sure about the premise of what South Africa brought, and so we're going to abstain and walk back from this. So that struck me as showing Canada's, unfortunately, showing Canada's true colors with respect to this. With respect to the second case in front of the ICJ that we just talked about, Canada did file a very brief 5-page written statement in July of 2023 with the court with respect to the question of illegal occupation. And it took a position very close to what the United States and the United Kingdom said, which is probably reflective of what Israel was wanting, asking the court not to use this discretion, not to answer the question, because there is a peace process that should lead to a two-state solution. And therefore, having the General Assembly um, ask the court for a ruling on this will only make it more difficult for the parties to come to a resolution. I mean, the exact opposite is the case. What are we to learn from a 30-year process of the Oslo process that was initiated in September 1993, where at the time when we had that famous handshake on the White House lawn, there were approximately 115,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank.
Right.
Today, in 2024, slightly more than 30 years after that handshake, there are more than 515,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank, more than 4 times as many. That, to me, is the single most compelling statistic as to what a failure the Oslo peace process is, and what a failure the global North has committed in allowing Israel to continue with its policy of intense settler population of occupied territory in defiance of international law, in defiance indeed of Canadian law with respect to this. And it seems more and more distant, the prospect of a two-state solution, when you look at the facts on the ground that Israel has created, all, if you like, with either the active support or the benign neglect coming from the global North. Israel is a small country. It's a population of 9 million citizens. It depends heavily both on international trade for its economic well-being and on international diplomatic support. If the global North wanted to see an immediate end to the occupation and the creation of a genuine, independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, all it would have to do is say, Israel, we're cutting off our diplomatic relations, we're reviewing our economic relations, we're reviewing our arms sales to you. And that would be sufficient, I think, to change the mind. But if you keep on expecting over and over again, by giving Israel more weapons sales, giving them free trade agreements, and defending them at the United Nations, what other result would be occurring other than Israel saying that, look, there's no cost to our deepening this occupation, to our maintaining de jure and de facto annexation than what we're doing now? Why would we do anything different?
Right. I mean, and you talk about active support. On the same day that the ICJ issued their ruling of the provisional measures,
Mm-hmm.
Canada, along with others in the global North, decided to pull or suspend funding from UNRWA, following allegations from Israeli officials that a handful out of the 13,000 UNRWA employees participated in the October 7th attacks. What do you think about the timing of that decision?
I'm not a conspiracy theory believer,
Right.
but I'm also one to want to know that sometimes things are more than simply coincidence when they wind up occurring, because almost immediately following the ICJ ruling and the statement that there was a plausible case of genocide, within a day we wind up getting these allegations being released. Initially noted by the head of UNRWA, which is the UN agency that services Palestinian refugees in the occupied Palestinian Territory, as well as in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And immediately, genocide got knocked off the headlines in the global and all of the media in the global North. And all we talked about then were these allegations with respect to UNRWA. Here we are, 6 weeks later. Canada has resumed its funding of UNRWA, as has Australia, and I would suspect very soon most other countries that suspended their funding will resume it. We have repeated statements coming from the European Union, from American intelligence agencies saying that there has been no evidence presented by Israel with respect to its allegations that this handful of of UNRWA employees who were engaged in the violence and the atrocities of October 7th. I don't think the funding should have been suspended in the first place. Here you have the absolutely worst humanitarian catastrophe in the 21st century going. You have the one agency with 13,000 employees on the ground who have this deep experience uh, to be able to deliver humanitarian aid, and you're cutting off their funding. Now, luckily, UNRWA had enough funding to last through February and into March. And I'm hoping that the funding from the other countries will resume very soon because UNRWA still is at the edge. But I disagree with cutting off the funding in the first place. Even if these allegations were true, even if you put the Israeli argument at its very highest with regards to this, what would you have the organization do? These allegations are presented to them, and they took immediate administrative steps. They fired the employees. There's no thought that UNRWA in any organized way was involved in the atrocities of October 7th. It committed itself to having an external review done through the United Nations. It publicized the fact that these allegations had been made, and then pleaded for the fact that humanitarian aid had to be continued. So I didn't see the logic in cutting off the aid. If you had 12 employees at a major hospital or in a major healthcare system who wound up doing something atrocious, separate from what their work was doing, would you cut off funding to that health system in order to be able to punish the organization? No. I mean, if the organization acted with speed, with responsibility, with a commitment to review what happened, and there's nothing to implicate that organization in what the alleged wrongdoing was, why would you punish the organization instead of allowing it to continue with its ability to handle the situation?
Right.
So, so yes, it wound up punishing the UN. It wound up punishing the ability to get aid in effective ways. We're seeing now into Gaza with all of this levels of starvation and famine ongoing. And then it turns out that the accusations appear to be hollow because Israel is not presenting any of its raw intelligence or refined intelligence to the countries who were funding UNRWA.
Right. And when we talk about the immediate need for UNRWA is extremely important, obviously, because of their ability to deliver
Yeah.
aid on the ground.
hmm
But there seems to be a concerted effort to discredit and target UNRWA as an organization in
hmm
general.
Yeah.
To that speaks to the importance of the organization for the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
And so, can you talk a little bit about how important this organization is to the overall Palestinian
Yeah. Yeah.
movement?
So the organization is now 75 years old. It was created, I believe, in 1949 into 1950 to take over from private humanitarian organizations that were caring for the roughly 750,000 Palestinian refugees out of the 1947-1949 war that followed the creation of the State of Israel. Um, UNRWA has been important in terms of being able to provide educational services, health services, and administrative services to allow them, to be able to make lives with dignity, either in the camps or outside of the camps. It has also stood, most importantly, as a symbol of the Palestinian right to return. The United Nations General Assembly in December 1948 enacted Resolution 194, which, among other things, said that Palestinian refugees have a right to return. That resolution has been re-endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly on more than 100 occasions since. I think it is probably the single most re-endorsed resolution in the history of the United Nations. So UNRWA stands for the ability of the right of Palestinians to exercise their legal right under international law to return to their homes and to their homeland. This is anathema to Israel. Israel wants to be able to liquidate the Palestinian refugee issue and have the refugees resettled elsewhere or within some kind of little statelet that the Palestinians might have at the end. It doesn't want the refugees to be able to return to where they came from. And this is why I think UNRWA has such an extraordinary symbolic level in both the United Nations system, but also in the Middle East as well. Um, Israel now sees the opportunity to be able to make these slanders against UNRWA um, in order to be able to end UNRWA. It's saying that will not allow UNRWA to resume operations in Gaza. The United States, alas, appears to be passing legislation that would permanently cut off its funding to UNRWA. The United States has, until this point in time, been the largest single annual donor to UNRWA. And UNRWA is, keep in mind, there's 13,000 employees in Gaza. There's another 18,000 or so employees of UNRWA in Lebanon, Syria,
Right.
and Jordan. So it covers actually an extraordinary large area of work. It's the largest single UN agency in terms of employment. All this on a shoestring budget of a little more than $1 billion.
Right.
So it's offering, I think, high quality administrative services, as well as maintaining this political symbol for a relatively low amount of money. But even that is too much for Israel to want to be able to maintain. But I should also add that you also have Israeli security officials making trips to European capitals and particularly to the United States, arguing in quiet that UNRWA's services are indispensable, that it shouldn't be allowed to disappear because there's no way that Israel or indeed these other Arab countries would ever able to take over the kinds of services that UNRWA is able to do.
Very interesting.
So publicly, Israel will condemn UNRWA and want to see its end. Privately, its intelligence and security officials will say this is keeping quiet in the Middle East, and we need you to continue.
Interesting. And we're not immune to it in Canada. I mean, we've had key political party leaders like Pierre Poilievre, for example, uh, openly state that if he's elected, he's going to defund UNRWA, whatever that means. And from a Canadian perspective, I
Yeah,
know our
and remember, we went
contributions.
through this already with
Right.
Poilievre's predecessor, Stephen Harper.
Right.
He had cut off funding to UNRWA and maintained that during most of the years that he was in power, and that was when Justin Trudeau became prime minister in late 2015. He did two things that changed Canadian policy towards the Middle East. One is that he restored UNRWA funding, and I'm glad of that. And two, he changed the tone, if not the essence, of Canadian policy towards Israel and Palestine. You didn't hear this Israel right or wrong kind of rhetoric coming from Justin Trudeau that you did hear all the while coming from Stephen Harper with regards to this.
Right. And what is Canada's obligation in terms of all of this from an international law perspective? And we hear about the rules-based international order and how we have to respect that, and we believe in it. What is Canada actually obligated to do by international law?
Sure. In the Middle East, international law has been, over the last 75 years, much closer to power than it has been to justice. Is that there is no human rights conflict in the modern world where international law has spoken so clearly, so consistently, so urgently with respect to a range of rights. The right of Palestinians to self-determination, the fact that the settlements are a flagrant violation under international law, annexation is a flagrant violation under international law. There should be a two-state solution. The Palestinian refugees have the right to return. Israel's wall that is built primarily within the West Bank is illegal and must be dismantled, and more. All of this has been frequently proclaimed by the Security Council of the United Nations, the General Assembly, by the International Court of Justice, and yet none of this winds up getting applied. It's extraordinary the amount of daylight that exists between the demands and requirements and obligations of international law on the one hand, and what actually winds up getting implemented on the other. And Canada, alas, is primarily on the side of wanting to dampen and minimize the role of international law in all of this. During the past 12 or 13 years, Canada has had a voting record at the General Assembly of opposing almost all of the resolutions with respect to Israel and Palestine. Um, and it doesn't argue that they're wrong in international law. It doesn't argue that they're wrong in the politics. It simply says, oh, there's too many resolutions on Israel and Palestine. Israel's being singled out, and we're opposed to that, as opposed to saying Israel has an obligation and a responsibility to apply international law and to wind up following it. Um, so keep in mind, this has consequences for Canada.
Absolutely.
In 2010 and again in 2020, Canada made serious bids to get a seat on the Security Council.
Yes, I remember that.
And we have been a member of the Security Council roughly every 10 years, beginning around 1950. So we again applied in 2010 under Stephen Harper, and they lost. And within a few weeks, Harper government was saying, "Look, we took a principled stand with respect to Israel and Palestine, i.e., supporting Israel, and if that costs us the seat on the Security Council, so be it." That also is reflective, probably, of the low regard that Stephen Harper had with respect to the United Nations. Now we went to 2020 with Justin Trudeau in power, and even power by that time for about 4.5 years, with a much different public persona and a much different, at least advertised foreign policy. And we ran against Ireland and Norway for the 2 seats on the Security Council for the geographic sector that we were in. Think of the advantages that Canada had going into that vote. We're a country of almost 40 million people. We have enormous diasporas coming from various parts of the world living in Canada as Canadians who have strong relationships to the regions and the countries where they came from. Norway and Ireland, on the other hand, are countries with 5 million people living in each of them, with very small foreign diasporas. Canada is a member of the G7. They aren't. Canada is a member of the G20. Neither is Norway and Ireland are not. Canada is a member of the Commonwealth. Canada is a member of the Francophonie. Canada is a member of the Pan-Pacific Partnership. We have enormous projection of international power and international reputation facing Ireland and Norway, and we lost. And one primary reason why we lost was that Ireland and Norway have very good voting records and very good track records when it comes to Palestine and Israel. Canada does not. That is an important issue with respect to diplomats coming from the global south. And that's primarily the reason why, one of the primary reasons as to why Canada wound up losing, in spite of all the advantages that we had going into that particular contest.
Right. And if I'm a Canadian listening to this, I'm not even related to anybody from Palestine. I don't care about the issue at all. That bothers me, right? I like anyone like me grew up with this perception we were taught in school that, Canada has this great global reputation. We're known as peacekeepers. People love us everywhere. And so this issue is changing that global perception in a way and harming the average Canadian. And they may not even realize it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to our international reputation. It's not as high as it could be. We often think of Canada as a middle power that punches above its weight. And in some areas, we have shown daring, and we have shown initiative. For example, on the issue of mines, we led the international effort to pass the treaty trying to ban the use of mines in combat during war. But in other areas, particularly with respect to Israel and Palestine, we're far behind where the curve is, and the world knows that we're far behind.
Right. We're sitting at a historic moment in a way today. So tomorrow on March 18th, the NDP will be putting forth a motion in Parliament, which calls for suspending all trade in military goods and technology with Israel and increase efforts to stop the illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas, officially recognize the state of Palestine and maintain Canada's recognition of Israel's right to exist and to live in peace with its neighbors, among a series of other things. What do you expect to come from this motion?
Well, I expect probably a pretty passionate debate will occur, first of all, in the House of Commons with respect to this. I'm pleased that the NDP is using its rare opposition period in the House of Commons to be able to put an emphasis with respect to this. The NDP has, for the past several years actually had a fairly progressive position with respect to Israel, including with respect to the sale of weapons to Israel. And now, over the past 5 months, the war has only, I think, intensified the spotlight on its particular position, which is why we're seeing this historic debate occurring on Monday, the 18th of March. Um, It'll be interesting. I mean, where the real interest will be is how many liberal backbenchers are going to wind up supporting this. I think we know that the Conservative Party will be voting probably almost entirely as a bloc against it. Um, I don't know exactly how the Bloc Québécois, with its 35 or 34 MPs, will be voting with respect. I suspect some will be voting in favor of it. But I know that there's an intense debate among liberal backbenchers with respect to whether or not to support this or not. So we'll have to see where the vote winds up coming from. The cabinet will either vote against it because it's not Canadian policy. There might be a couple of cabinet ministers who abstain or simply just don't show up to vote regarding this. But at the very least, even if the vote is defeated in the House of Commons, it will focus public attention on this particular dynamic issue at this crucial time in Canadian foreign policy.
Right. And the motion itself, like if you read it, they're not asking for anything that is outside of what Canada's existing laws say. Like Canada already has laws that says if you suspect that these weapons are going to be used in violation of human rights, then they're not supposed to prove them. So that's the part that's interesting to me is I don't think that they're asking for anything extraordinary.
Um, Virtually everything in that resolution, you're absolutely right, is anchored either in Canadian law or in international law or both with regards to this. In some ways, I think the resolution could have gone even further. It talks about wanting to ban violent settlers. I think we should be banning settlement goods coming into Canada. In fact, that's what UN Security Council resolutions, both in 1980 and again in 2016, have stated that countries have to distinguish absolutely between Israel and the territories that it winds up occupying, and there should be no trade in goods and services coming from the Israeli settlements. I wish they had gone further with respect to that, but it is a motion worthy of support and would really move the dial, I think, on Canadian foreign policy respecting Israel and Palestine.
Right. And then on those settlements, I think we've seen cases in the past, like I can't remember if it was Dimitri Lascaris or somebody else, but I believe it was a lawsuit against the Canada Food Inspection Agency.
Yes, this had to do with not with the banning of settlement wines coming into Canada, but simply their labeling. Instead of saying "made product of Israel," saying a product of a settlement in the West Bank. It was exceptionally modest in what it was looking for, because I think international law would actually compel us to ban it. But an interested citizen, David Kattenberg, the son of Holocaust survivors, brought a motion with respect to compelling the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to properly order the proper labeling of Israeli settlement wines coming into Canada, and the federal government opposed that. There was I think a victory at the federal court, but then the federal court of appeal essentially overturned that ruling, and the matter I think is now dormant to the best of my understanding. But that also shows, I think, when the chips are down, where does the Canadian government wind up standing? And they opposed the efforts by a private Canadian citizen to force a minimal standard with respect to the identification of settlement goods coming into Canada.
Right. And, when we talk about Canada's role in all of this, could we see a scenario where a couple years down the line, the ICJ does rule that genocide has taken place in Gaza? Could we see a scenario where Canada is held accountable for enabling such a genocide?
Well, Article 3 of the 1948 Genocide Convention, of which we are a signatory, says that it's a crime to be complicit in the conduct of genocide. And there's a case being brought now by Nicaragua to the International Court of Justice against Germany for arguing that that Germany has been complicit with respect to genocide, once having known that there was a good possibility, a reasonable possibility, a plausible case of genocide being committed by Israel with respect to Gaza, that Germany continued to send arms and weapons uh, to Israel. There's also litigation in the United States, which is trying to hold the Biden administration um, complicit, or point out that they're complicit in the conduct of genocide by its um, weapons and arms support for Israel. So if that neither of those cases have been determined yet, but if they were determined that there was complicity by Germany or by the United States, certainly that would open up the door with respect to Canada or other countries that have been engaging in arms sales with Israel after the 7th of October, after the full knowledge of what was occurring there, after knowing what the ICJ's provisional measures decision was, define complicity with respect to genocide.
Right. And you can sort of see it in the statements that are coming out from the Minister of Foreign Affairs office, where they're not entirely being clear now as to whether or not they are, providing weapons to Israel or engaging in arms trade. And part of that, I think, is a political decision. But is there also um, you know, an idea of not being open about it in case something like this does come down the line?
Of course, I mean, I think right now it's embarrassing to say we're selling arms to Israel. Um, Keep in mind that the distinction that the Canadian government is trying to make is we're continuing to sell arms to, or we're continuing to sell material to Israel that has a military component to it. But these are non-lethal weapons.
Right.
We're not selling rifles. I think we're selling trucks or other forms of four-wheel military vehicles that, in and of themselves, don't have weapons attached to them. So this is the fine distinction that any politician would want you to do. As a lawyer, I'm always aware what happens when you've got a very good lawyer who's defending a bad client or a weak case. They're going to want to change the dial with respect to where you're looking at. They're going to want you to look over here instead of looking here. They're going to start, quoting a really ancient precedent. They're going to want to say, look at this other case. That's even worse than here. So you can't you got to make comparisons with respect to this. So that's what countries and foreign affairs ministers will do, is to try to minimize what the perception is, what they're complicit in or what they're involved in a case which raises so many profound moral, political, and legal questions.
Right. And we've seen, I mean, even if we don't talk about accountability from the international system, we've seen citizens beginning to make their elected officials hold them accountable. So we've seen things in the U.S. like the campaign abandoned Biden. We've seen people making similar arguments here in Canada. What are your thoughts on that, about holding our elected officials accountable when the courts may not do that for years or ever?
It's a wonderful thing. I mean, we have we have seen, I guess, a rise in popular opinion with respect to the horrors that people are witnessing, even if sometimes it's done in a filtered way through our mainstream media. They understand, I think, the depth of the agony that Gaza is going through, and this is reflective not only of what's been going on for the last 5 months, but for the past 57 years of occupation and for the past 75 years of dispossession. Um, so the ability to be able to hold politicians accountable by protesting in front of their constituency offices, by flooding their offices with letters and emails, by voting uncommitted in American presidential primaries, by stopping traffic, by holding demonstrations in Grand Central Station or go through the streets of Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. All of this, I think, politicians have to begin to realize there's a staying power with regards to this. And I'm pleased to see that members of the Muslim community in Canada have taken a stand saying, unless you call for a ceasefire as a political leader, you are not welcomed in our mosques and our community centers around the country. I mean, that sends, I think, a strong message that politicians are hearing in Canada, which is why I think you're seeing this slow but steady change in public rhetoric coming from the Canadian government around what's going on in Gaza.
Right. And this isn't something new, is it? I mean, if you think back to all the previous wars that have happened, like the Vietnam War or the sanctioning of apartheid South Africa,
Mhm.
this started as movements of people protesting and forcing their elected officials to take action. It's not something that they typically do on their own accord.
Of course, what you're doing is wanting to change utterly the political climate, the political ecosystem with respect to that, so that we permanently changed our minds with respect to Israel and Palestine. Um, I'm old enough, alas, to know that I thought great change was on the horizon after the 1982 war that Israel conducted in Lebanon, when 18,000 people were killed over the course of 2.5 months, and which culminated in the massacres in Sabra and Shatila camps. And yet, not a lot changed. So I do worry. I hold the hope that there'll be great change, that people won't forget the 30,000 plus who have died in Gaza. That we're looking at the possibility of a permanent change with respect to how we look at Israel. But I'm also been around long enough to know that unless that pressure is maintained on a constant, regular, persistent basis, um, we face the very real threat of drifting back to where we were before October 7th with respect to Israel and Palestine. So this has to be kept up. Martin Luther King once said, the arc of history bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. And that's right. But then the Reverend Jesse Jackson also added to that. He said, the it only bends if we make it bend. So it has to be our own individual and collective efforts to wind up changing history, or we face the very real risk of it drifting back to where we were before.
Right. I want to end with a little bit of a philosophical question for you. It seems like there are rules for allies and rules for everybody else. Might is right appears to be the dominant narrative. What happens to our world when rules aren't applied fairly to everyone?
We live in a world that has a complex and interlocking forms of international law. We are particularly strong with respect to international human rights law. It was put in there because of the horrors of the Second World War, because of the stench of colonialism, because of the stench of slavery before that, and we rhetorically support all the principles and values and virtues of international human rights law. But the real test, obviously, is in what you do, not what you wind up saying. International law by itself won't liberate Palestine, but international law combined with international initiative will. And so it has to be both the legal and the political. So when the International Court of Justice winds up ruling that there's a plausible case of genocide, then the pressure has to be put at the political level in the United Nations and in each national capital to put that into action. If the International Court of Justice winds up ruling this summer that the occupation is illegal, then we have to wind up using that. But international law is not only for lawyers or law professors. It's there to protect all of us. So if the occupation winds up being ruled to be illegal, if the court eventually finds that there's genocide having been committed by Israel, then those simply aren't legal gains that we've made in the name of all of us. They have to be legal tools, all of us who care about justice and equality, and having a single standard for measuring rights wherever they may exist or being challenged in the world, to be able to use in our campaigns to say, we're not simply talking about an occupation in Palestine, we're talking about a legal occupation. We're not simply talking about a war in Gaza, we're talking about a genocide in Gaza. And we have to be able to use that to change the pattern of behavior by our political leaders and those who are our thought leaders in our society.
Right. Michael, it's been such a pleasure. I mean, this has been a conversation that I've been looking forward to for a long time, and it has exceeded my expectations. So thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate you being here, and I look forward to reading your upcoming writings and whatever it is that you have available. I'll be watching all of that. So
Basil, I'm deeply honored by being asked to come. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and good luck with this program in the future.
thank you very much.